March 23, 1945. The western banks of the Rhine River, near Remagen, Germany. Lieutenant James Howard of the 761st Tank Battalion crouched behind the turret of his Sherman tank, watching German defensive positions through his binoculars as artillery shells whistled overhead in the cold morning air. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and his breath formed small clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. Behind him, the massive bridge at Remagen, captured intact by American forces weeks earlier in a stroke of extraordinary fortune, continued to funnel troops and equipment across the river, despite repeated attempts by desperate German forces to destroy it. The German forces dug into the hills beyond, believed they faced just another American unit, another wave of soldiers they could slow down, maybe even repel if their ammunition held out and if reinforcements arrived in time. They had no idea that what they were about to witness would shatter every assumption their leadership had fed them for over a decade. The propaganda machine that had sustained their worldview was about to collide with a reality that would prove impossible to deny or dismiss. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened over the next 72 hours would transform hardened soldiers who had been taught to see their opponents as inferior into men who would carry stories of courage, discipline, and humanity across prison camps and eventually back to their homes, where their testimony would challenge an entire generation's understanding of race, warfare, and what it truly meant to be a soldier. The confrontation between propaganda and reality would be so stark, so undeniable, that it would create cognitive dissonance powerful enough to break through years of systematic indoctrination. For some, this would be the beginning of a lifelong journey toward understanding how they had been deceived and manipulated. For others, it would be a painful but necessary lesson in the consequences of blind belief in authority. For all of them, it would be an experience they could never forget and could never fully reconcile with what they had been taught to expect. Lieutenant Howard was 26 years old, a graduate of Howard University, who had enlisted in 1942 despite knowing the military would place him in a segregated unit. His decision to enlist had disappointed his father, a successful physician in Washington, D.C., who had hoped his son would follow him into medicine and avoid the discrimination he knew pervaded the military. But Howard felt a calling stronger than his father's concerns. He believed that African American soldiers, proving themselves in combat, could advance the cause of civil rights more effectively than any number of protests or legal challenges. He had studied military history at university, reading everything from Julius Caesar's commentaries to accounts of the First World War, and he understood that warriors who demonstrated exceptional competence earned respect that transcended social prejudices. His thesis had examined the service of African American soldiers during the First World War and how their contributions had been systematically minimized in official histories. He was determined that his generation would not suffer the same erasure. The 761st Tank Battalion was one of the few African American armored units in the entire United States Army, formed in 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The choice of Louisiana for training was itself a statement about the military's expectations and priorities. The camp was located in a state where segregation was absolute and where African American soldiers faced hostility from local civilians. Training in such an environment was meant to be demoralizing, a constant reminder of second-class status. But the soldiers of the 761st transformed this intended humiliation into motivation. Every slight, every insult, every act of discrimination became fuel for their determination to excel. They had trained for 2 years on outdated equipment, often receiving tanks that white units had already deemed unfit for service. The first Shermans they received in early 1944 were older models with mechanical issues that required constant maintenance. Some had been damaged in earlier engagements and repaired poorly. Others simply reflected the reality that newer, better equipment went to units that the military leadership valued more highly. The soldiers of the 761st learned to maintain these machines with a level of care and attention that exceeded what was taught in manuals. They improvised solutions to mechanical problems that should have required factory repairs. They became expert mechanics out of necessity because failure was not an option they could afford. A white unit that experienced mechanical failures might receive sympathy and replacement equipment. An African American unit that experienced failures would face accusations of incompetence that would be used to justify continued discrimination. Their first operational Shermans arrived only months before deployment to Europe in October 1944. These were newer models, M4A3 variants with the improved 75mm gun and better armor distribution. The tanks weighed 33 tons fully loaded, could travel at speeds up to 30 miles per hour on roads, and carried a crew of 5. Each tank consumed approximately 1 gallon of fuel for every 2 miles traveled, which meant that logistics and supply lines were as important as combat capability. The soldiers learned every aspect of their vehicles, from the engine's 420 horsepower to the traverse mechanism that rotated the turret. They practiced loading drills until they could fire 6 aimed shots per minute. They rehearsed emergency procedures until they could evacuate a damaged tank in under 30 seconds. This level of preparation was not typical, but rather reflected their understanding that they would be judged by a higher standard than other units. Standing next to Howard was Sergeant Robert Hayes, a 31-year-old former auto worker from Detroit who had maintained every engine in their company with a precision that had kept their tanks running when others failed. Hayes had grown up in the shadow of Ford's River Rouge plant, where his father had worked on the assembly lines that produced Model T automobiles. He had learned mechanics by observing, asking questions, and eventually working alongside his father during summer breaks from school. By the time he was 18, he could disassemble and rebuild an engine faster than men twice his age. When the Great Depression hit, his skills kept his family fed when others went hungry. He found work in small repair shops, fixing everything from farm equipment to delivery trucks. When war came and the military needed mechanics, Hayes enlisted with the hope that his abilities would finally be recognized on merit rather than skin color. He had been denied officer training 3 times, despite scoring in the top 5% on every examination administered. The reason was never stated officially, but every man in the unit knew why. The military in 1942 was still deeply segregated, with separate training facilities, separate recreational areas, and an unwritten but absolute rule that African American soldiers would not command white soldiers. Hayes could have commanded a tank platoon with the same competence as any white officer, but the system was not designed to recognize competence that challenged racial hierarchies. Instead, he remained a sergeant, technically subordinate to officers who often had less experience and less natural aptitude for leadership. The injustice burned, but Hayes channeled his frustration into ensuring that every tank under his care functioned perfectly. If he could not command through rank, he would command through indispensability. The tank crews had developed a level of cohesion that comes only from shared hardship and mutual trust. They had trained together for so long that verbal commands were often unnecessary. Howard could indicate a target with a slight gesture, and his gunner would already be traversing toward it. Hayes could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, identifying subtle changes in rhythm that indicated developing mechanical issues before they became critical failures. This level of expertise was not accidental, but rather the product of thousands of hours of training that exceeded what was required of other units. The soldiers of the 761st understood implicitly that they could not afford to be merely competent. They had to be exceptional. Across the river, Obergefreiter Klaus Richter pressed himself into a foxhole, his hands trembling not from cold, but from exhaustion. At 22 years old, Richter had spent 3 years on the Eastern Front before being transferred west in February. The propaganda newspapers his unit received had prepared him for many things, but they had specifically warned about these American troops. The language used was explicit and dehumanizing, describing the African American soldiers as primitive, undisciplined, and cowardly. Richter had read these reports repeatedly during the long train journey from Poland to the Western Front, absorbing the hateful rhetoric that permeated every official publication. In his exhaustion and desperation, he wanted to believe them. Believing that the enemy across the river was inferior made the impossible task of holding this position seem somehow more achievable. His commanding officer had reinforced these messages during briefings, using language that dehumanized the approaching American forces and suggested they would be easy to defeat, despite all evidence to the contrary. Next to him, Unteroffizier Werner Baumann, a 35-year-old veteran who had fought in France in 1940 and in Russia from 1941 to 1944, checked his ammunition with the practiced efficiency of someone who had survived far longer than the average infantryman. Baumann had seen the evolution of the conflict from the early victories in France, where the military machine seemed invincible, through the brutal, grinding warfare in Russia, where that sense of invincibility died in the frozen wasteland outside Moscow. He had witnessed the transformation of the forces he served from a confident, well-supplied army to a desperate defensive force struggling with shortages of everything from ammunition to food. He had watched as younger and younger soldiers arrived at the front, boys barely old enough to shave, sent to hold positions against enemies whose material superiority grew more overwhelming with each passing month. Baumann had learned to trust his eyes over propaganda long before the current desperate situation. He had seen Russian soldiers fight with a ferocity and competence that contradicted every racist assumption about Slavic peoples. He had witnessed Soviet industrial capacity that dwarfed anything his own side could produce. But even he held unconscious assumptions about what soldiers from different backgrounds were capable of achieving. The propaganda about African American troops had been different in tone from the propaganda about Soviet forces. It emphasized not military capability, but fundamental human inadequacy, suggesting that these soldiers would flee at the first sign of danger, that they lacked the discipline for modern warfare, that their officers could not control them. Baumann did not fully believe these claims, but neither had he entirely rejected them. He had learned to be skeptical of propaganda that told him what he wanted to hear, but skepticism was not the same as complete rejection. Some part of him still hoped that perhaps just this once the propaganda might be true, and that the approaching American forces might prove less formidable than those he had already faced. The defensive position Baumann's unit occupied had been prepared hastily over the previous 3 days. They had dug trenches, established machine gun positions, and positioned the few anti-tank weapons they still possessed in locations that offered the best fields of fire. But the defenses were inadequate for the task they faced. The unit was under strength, missing more than 40% of its authorized personnel. Ammunition was rationed strictly, with orders to conserve rounds for when targets were certain. Artillery support was virtually non-existent, with the few remaining guns prioritized for other sectors. Medical supplies were limited to basic bandages and morphine. Food consisted of hard bread, potatoes, and whatever could be foraged from abandoned buildings. The men were exhausted, having retreated steadily for weeks under constant pressure from advancing American forces. Many suffered from minor ailments that in earlier years would have resulted in medical furlough, but now had to be endured. Morale was low, sustained only by fear of what would happen if they retreated without orders, and by the faint hope that perhaps some miracle would turn the tide of the war. The 761st had already proven themselves exceptional during the advance through France and the brutal winter campaign in the Ardennes. They had been attached to the 7th Army and had fought with distinction during the German counter-offensive in December and January. During the offensive later known as the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces achieved tactical surprise and created a dangerous bulge in Allied lines, the 761st had been among the units rushed forward to contain the breakthrough. They had fought in conditions that tested every aspect of their training and character. Temperatures dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, snow made movement difficult and concealment nearly impossible. Supply lines were stretched thin, and units went days without hot food or adequate shelter. Yet the 761st maintained their defensive positions, repelled multiple attacks, and eventually participated in the counter-offensive that eliminated the bulge and restored the front line. During one particularly intense engagement near Tillit, Belgium, in early January, Lieutenant Howard's tank had been the anchor for a defensive position that held against 3 separate assaults over a 14-hour period. They had expended nearly all their ammunition, with the loader bringing up the last shells from storage as German infantry attempted to close within range for close assault weapons. When the engagement finally ended, Howard's tank had been struck twice by anti-tank rounds that failed to penetrate, leaving deep scars in the armor that would remain visible for the rest of the war. The crew had eaten nothing but cold rations for 3 days and had slept in shifts inside the cramped tank interior, where temperatures barely rose above freezing, despite the body heat of 5 men. Yet when ordered to advance the following morning, the Deliverance moved forward, with the same reliability it had shown throughout the campaign. But news of their achievements rarely made it into official reports that reached the American public, and it certainly never crossed enemy lines to challenge the propaganda German soldiers consumed. The military's public relations approach to African American units was cautious at best, reluctant to highlight their successes in ways that might strengthen arguments for integration or equal treatment. Photographs of African American soldiers in combat were rare in newspapers and newsreels. When they appeared, they were often in subordinate roles or performing support functions rather than leading combat operations. The disconnect between reality and public perception was stark. African American soldiers were fighting and dying in the same battles as white soldiers, demonstrating the same courage and competence, yet receiving a fraction of the recognition. This erasure was not accidental, but rather reflected a deliberate policy to maintain existing social hierarchies, even as those hierarchies were being challenged by the very existence of effective African American combat units. As dawn broke on March 23rd, the American artillery barrage intensified. Howard received orders through his radio headset to advance once the shelling stopped. His tank, which his crew had nicknamed Deliverance, carried 97 shells for its 75mm main gun, 3,000 rounds for its 30-caliber machine guns, and enough fuel to travel roughly 100 miles under combat conditions. More importantly, it carried 5 men who had trained together for so long that they functioned as a single organism. The loader, Private First Class Marcus Webb, was 19 years old and could load a shell, confirm the breech was sealed, and call ready in under 4 seconds. The driver, Corporal Thomas Richardson, could navigate terrain that would trap less experienced operators. The bow gunner, Private Eugene Carter, had the sharpest eyes in the company, and the radio operator, Private David Chen, handled communications with a clarity that kept their tank coordinated with the unit, even in the chaos of combat. When the artillery fell silent, Howard gave the order. 12 Sherman tanks from Able Company rolled forward, their engines roaring as they approached improvised crossing points where combat engineers had already begun work, preparing fords and small bridges capable of supporting armored vehicles. The sound of a Sherman's 500 horsepower engine was distinctive, a mechanical thunder that announced American industrial might. Each engine was a Ford GAA V8, producing enough power to propel 33 tons of steel and armament at speeds that would have seemed impossible to tankers from the previous war. The engine required precise maintenance, careful attention to oil levels and temperatures, and a crew that understood the mechanical symphony they commanded. German defenders heard that sound multiplied by 12 and knew that behind each tank came infantry, supplies, and the weight of a production capacity they could not match. The American advantage was not just in quality, but in overwhelming quantity. For every Sherman lost, 3 more waited in reserve. For every soldier who fell, 2 more had completed training and were ready for deployment. This mathematical reality was as demoralizing as any tactical defeat. The crossing itself was a vulnerable moment, the point where tanks moved slowly through water or over improvised bridges, unable to maneuver effectively if engaged. German doctrine emphasized hitting enemy armor during river crossings when speed and mobility were constrained. But executing that doctrine required coordination, adequate ammunition, and soldiers who still believed victory was possible. Richter's unit had the ammunition, barely, and they had positions with good fields of fire. What they lacked was the coordination and confidence that made doctrine effective. Richter watched the tanks approach and felt his stomach tighten. The defensive positions his unit held were meant to slow the American advance, not stop it. Everyone knew the war was lost, though saying so openly could result in immediate and brutal consequences. He had seen two soldiers from another unit face severe military punishment for defeatism just weeks earlier, an incident that had been carried out as a public warning. The harsh discipline had been administered by military police, who seemed more concerned with maintaining control among their own forces than with fighting the approaching enemy. That image of German soldiers facing punishment from other German soldiers while enemy forces drew closer had shaken something fundamental in Richter's understanding of the war. He raised his Panzerfaust, a single-shot anti-tank weapon that was effective at ranges under 60 meters. The weapon was simple, almost crude, consisting of a tube, a warhead, and a basic sight. It required the operator to expose himself to aim and fire, making it as dangerous to the user as to the target. His hands steadied as training took over. He had been taught that American tank crews were predictable, that they would bunch together and present easy targets. He had been shown films and diagrams suggesting that American tankers lacked proper training, that they relied on numerical superiority rather than tactical skill. He wanted desperately to believe these teachings because if they were false, then everything else he had been told might also be false, and that possibility was too overwhelming to confront directly. But as the Shermans crossed the river, they spread into a tactical formation that maximized their supporting fire while minimizing their vulnerability. Each tank covered the advance of others. When one paused to fire, two others moved. Howard had learned these tactics from manuals written at Fort Knox and refined them through months of actual operations. The 761st had studied armored warfare with an intensity born from knowing they would receive no special allowances for mistakes. The first Panzerfaust shot missed as the targeted Sherman jerked sideways at precisely the moment Richter fired. The second Panzerfaust, fired by another soldier 50 meters down the line, struck a Sherman commanded by Lieutenant Charles Thomas, but the angle was poor and the shaped charge failed to penetrate. Thomas's tank returned fire immediately, the 75mm shell destroying the German position in a concussion that left Richter's ears ringing. What followed was 40 minutes of intense engagement. The German defensive line, thinly manned and low on ammunition, fought with the desperation of men who knew retreat meant certain capture or worse. The 761st advanced with methodical precision, their tanks providing covering fire as infantry units moved forward to clear positions. Sergeant Hayes commanded the third tank in the formation, and his gunner, Corporal James Brooks, had developed an almost intuitive sense for where targets would appear. When a German anti-tank gun revealed its position by firing at a neighboring Sherman, Brooks had already traversed the turret toward that location. His first shot struck the gun shield directly, rendering the weapon inoperable. By 1000 hours, the German defensive line had been breached. Richter found himself cut off from his unit with 3 other soldiers. They had expended their Panzerfaust ammunition and were down to rifles and a single machine gun with perhaps 200 rounds. The sensible option was surrender. But the propaganda they had consumed for years made surrender to these particular American troops terrifying. Everything they had been told suggested they would face brutal treatment. As American infantry approached their position, Richter made a decision that would haunt him with shame for the rest of his life. He raised a white cloth tied to a rifle barrel, the universal symbol of surrender recognized by all combatants. But then, driven by a complex mixture of fear, desperation, and deeply ingrained propaganda, he shouted in broken English the slur his propaganda had taught him to use. The words were vile, expressing the dehumanizing rhetoric that had justified atrocities across occupied territories. He shouted them believing they might provoke the Americans into some reaction that would justify fighting rather than surrendering. Some part of his mind, twisted by years of propaganda and months of desperate combat, thought that if he could make the Americans angry enough, they might act in ways that would confirm what he had been told about them. If they responded with brutality, then perhaps the propaganda was true. If they lost discipline, then perhaps he and his comrades were superior soldiers fighting for a just cause. The psychological mechanism was transparent in retrospect, but opaque in the moment. He needed the Americans to be what he had been told they were, because accepting that they were not would require accepting that everything he had believed was a lie. The American infantry squad that approached was led by Staff Sergeant William Thompson, a 30-year-old from Birmingham, Alabama, who had heard every variation of that word throughout his life. He had heard it from civilians in American towns who protested when his unit marched through on training exercises. He had heard it from white American officers who resented commanding black soldiers and made their feelings clear through tone and demeanor even when regulations prevented explicit statements. He had heard it screamed by opponents of integration who gathered at recruitment centers to harass African American volunteers. He had heard it whispered behind his back and shouted to his face. The word carried centuries of hatred, violence, and systematic oppression. It represented lynchings and discriminatory laws and daily humiliations too numerous to count. And yet, Thompson's response was not rage, but something more powerful and more difficult to achieve: professional discipline. Thompson had learned through hard experience that reacting to provocation gave power to the provocateur. He had learned that maintaining composure in the face of insult was not weakness but strength. He had learned that the most effective response to hatred was competence so undeniable that it could not be dismissed or minimized. He called out in clear English that the German soldiers should drop their weapons and move forward with their hands visible. His voice was calm, almost bored, as if the slur meant nothing, as if he had heard it so many times that it no longer registered as anything more than noise. Behind him, Private Isaiah Johnson, who spoke some German, learned from grandparents who had immigrated to Pennsylvania in 1906, repeated the instructions in German with the same professional tone. Johnson's German was accented but clear, and his demeanor matched Thompson's, calm, professional, utterly unaffected by the attempt at provocation. Richter and his companions had no choice. They dropped their weapons and emerged from their position, hands raised high, expecting violence. They expected to be struck, perhaps beaten, possibly shot. Everything they had been told suggested that surrender to these particular soldiers would result in brutal treatment. Yet what they received instead was a systematic search for hidden weapons conducted with efficient thoroughness, instructions to sit in a designated area delivered in clear German, and then something none of them anticipated: canteens of water and small portions of food from American rations. The water was clean, the first clean water some of them had tasted in days. The food was processed military rations, not luxurious, but nutritious, and more than what their own logistics could provide. Thompson's squad followed established protocols for processing prisoners, protocols that emphasized security, but also basic human dignity. The search for weapons was thorough but not unnecessarily rough. The instructions were clear, but not shouted or delivered with contempt. The provision of water and food was not generosity, but standard procedure, part of a system that treated prisoners according to international law, rather than according to the propaganda that had demonized them. Sergeant Thompson assigned 2 soldiers to guard the prisoners and moved on with his squad to continue clearing the sector. He did not lecture the German soldiers. He did not respond to the insult. He simply treated them according to the protocols established by the Geneva Conventions, which the United States military followed with far more consistency than the forces these men had served. Over the next 6 hours, as the 761st consolidated its position and dozens more German soldiers surrendered, something remarkable began to happen. The prisoners were processed efficiently, given basic medical attention for minor wounds, and organized into groups for transport to rear area holding facilities. African American soldiers supervised this process with a level of organization and humanity that contradicted everything the prisoners had been taught to expect. Obergefreiter Werner Baumann surrendered that afternoon after his position became untenable. At 35, he was older than most of the American soldiers processing prisoners, and he watched everything with sharp attention. He noticed that the American supply lines were functioning smoothly, that ammunition and fuel arrived regularly, that the soldiers had adequate food. He observed that the African American tank crews maintained their vehicles with meticulous care, that their equipment was well organized, and that their officers commanded with competence. That evening, prisoners were gathered in a temporary holding area where they received their first substantial meal since breakfast: heated rations that included meat, bread, fruit, and coffee. The quantity was modest by American standards, but luxurious compared to what German logistics could provide by March 1945. Richter ate slowly, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he had been taught. A young American soldier distributing rations noticed Richter's vacant stare. The soldier, Private Moses Williams from Mississippi, had seen that expression before on other prisoners. He had learned that sometimes silence was the most powerful response to hatred. He handed Richter an extra portion of bread without comment and moved on. The next morning, March 24th, the prisoners were moved to a more permanent facility, 10 kilometers behind the front lines. They traveled in trucks driven by African-American soldiers from logistics units. The trucks ran smoothly because the maintenance had been performed correctly. The route was organized efficiently because the planning had been thorough. Every aspect of their experience contradicted the propaganda they had consumed. At the prisoner processing center, German soldiers encountered even more cognitive dissonance. The facility was organized with systematic efficiency that rivaled anything they had experienced in their own military at its peak. Records were kept meticulously in multiple copies, with prisoner names, ranks, units, and capture dates recorded in neat handwriting in ledgers that would be maintained throughout the war. Medical staff treated injuries without regard to the prisoner's nationality, applying the same standards of care they would provide to American casualties. A German soldier with an infected wound received antibiotics and clean bandages. Another, with a broken arm sustained during capture, received proper splinting and pain medication. The medical personnel were professional and thorough, treating their patients as human beings requiring medical care rather than as enemies deserving only minimal attention. The camp commander, Captain Harold Miller, a 33-year-old former schoolteacher from Philadelphia, ran the facility according to strict regulations that ensured humane treatment. Miller had taught history and civics before the war, and he approached his current assignment with the same methodical attention to rules and procedures he had brought to his classroom. He believed deeply that how America treated its prisoners reflected American values, and that maintaining high standards even in warfare was essential to the moral credibility of the Allied cause. He conducted regular inspections to ensure that guards followed protocols, that food distribution was fair, that medical care was adequate, and that prisoners were protected from abuse. He maintained detailed logs of every incident, every complaint, every aspect of camp operations, creating a documentary record that would later be studied by military historians as an example of proper prisoner administration. The camp itself consisted of several large barracks buildings that had been commandeered from a former German military installation. Each barracks housed approximately 80 prisoners, with bunks arranged in rows and adequate space between them for basic privacy and movement. The buildings had heating, though fuel shortages meant temperatures were maintained at minimal comfort levels rather than full warmth. Latrines were adequate and kept reasonably clean through prisoner work details supervised by American guards. A mess hall provided 2 hot meals per day, with rations that met minimum nutritional requirements established by the Geneva Conventions. The food was basic and repetitive, but it was regular and adequate, which was more than could be said for what German logistics could provide to its own forces by March 1945. Prisoners were organized into work details that performed various tasks around the camp and in support of American logistics operations. These details were supervised by African-American soldiers who demonstrated the same competence in organization and management that characterized the entire operation. Work assignments were made fairly, with consideration for physical capability and health status. Soldiers who were injured or ill were excused from heavy labor. Those who had specialized skills were sometimes assigned tasks that made use of those skills. The work was not punitive, but functional, designed to keep prisoners occupied and to contribute to necessary tasks. What struck many prisoners most forcefully was the consistency with which rules were applied. When a prisoner violated camp regulations, the response was proportionate and fair. When a guard overstepped boundaries, Captain Miller corrected the behavior immediately. When disputes arose between prisoners, they were resolved through established procedures rather than through violence or favoritism. This consistency created a sense of order and predictability that was almost shocking to soldiers who had spent years in a military system where rules were applied arbitrarily and where survival often depended on the whims of commanders. For soldiers like Richter, who had spent weeks in the camp observing every detail, the contrast with his own experience became impossible to ignore. He found himself comparing the treatment he received as a prisoner to the treatment he had witnessed being given to prisoners taken by the forces he had served. He remembered Russian prisoners used as forced labor under conditions that ensured many would not survive. He remembered civilians in occupied territories subjected to collective punishments for the actions of resistance fighters. He remembered policies that explicitly denied Geneva Convention protections to certain categories of prisoners based on nationality or ethnicity. The comparison was damning, and it forced a reckoning with moral questions he had previously avoided confronting directly. Richter was assigned to a barracks with 40 other recent prisoners. That first night, lying on a clean cot with 2 blankets, he whispered to Baumann, who occupied the next bunk. The conversation was quiet, tentative, as both men tried to process what they were experiencing. Richter spoke first, his voice barely audible. He admitted that nothing about the past 24 hours matched what he had expected. He had expected brutality, chaos, perhaps revenge for the atrocities committed by the forces he had served. Instead, he had encountered discipline, organization, and a strict adherence to rules that protected even defeated enemies. Baumann responded with the wisdom of age and experience. He pointed out that truly superior forces did not need to prove their superiority through cruelty. They demonstrated it through competence, through the smooth functioning of systems, through the confidence that came from knowing they had already won. The African-American units they had encountered embodied that confidence because they had earned it through exceptional performance under circumstances that would have broken lesser soldiers. Over the following weeks, as prisoners remained in the camp awaiting transfer to larger facilities, they observed a military system functioning with precision. They saw African-American soldiers performing every role from maintenance to administration to security. They witnessed officers making complex decisions about logistics and organization. They experienced a level of professionalism that destroyed the propaganda they had been fed. One incident in particular became legendary among the prisoners and illustrated the depth of professionalism displayed by their captors. On March 27th, a group of recently captured German officers arrived at the camp. These were older men, career soldiers who had commanded battalions and regiments, who had spent decades in military service and had risen through ranks during the interwar period and the early years of the conflict. They arrived carrying the same assumptions that had infected the entire military system they served, assuming that African-American guards could be manipulated or intimidated through assertions of superiority. Their worldview was built on a foundation of racial hierarchy that placed them at the top, and others, particularly non-Europeans, far below. This worldview had been reinforced through years of propaganda, through military culture, and through a society that had embraced these hierarchies as fundamental truths. One officer, a Hauptmann who had commanded a regiment on the Eastern Front before being transferred west in February, attempted to assert authority over the guards almost immediately upon arrival. The Hauptmann was 42 years old, a career officer who had joined the military in 1924 and had served continuously since then. He had commanded men in combat across multiple fronts, had received decorations for leadership, and had internalized a sense of natural authority that came from years of unchallenged command. He demanded special privileges based on his rank, insisting on private quarters, better rations, and exemption from work details. He made dismissive comments about his captors, speaking in German to other officers, but loudly enough that the guards could hear the contemptuous tone, even if they did not understand the specific words. He assumed, based on everything he had been taught and experienced, that these guards would lack the confidence or authority to enforce regulations against officers who challenged them. The response came from Sergeant First Class Robert Jenkins, a 38-year-old career soldier who had enlisted in 1928 and had spent 17 years dealing with exactly this kind of behavior. Jenkins was the senior enlisted man in the camp, responsible for supervising guards and ensuring that procedures were followed correctly. He had experienced enough discrimination and disrespect during his military career to fill volumes, yet he had remained in service because he believed in something larger than his own advancement. He believed that by serving with distinction, By maintaining the highest standards of professionalism, he could challenge stereotypes and open doors for the African American soldiers who would come after him. Every slight he endured, every instance of discrimination he faced and overcame, was an investment in a future where such treatment would be impossible to justify. Jenkins listened to the German officer's demands without interruption, his face revealing nothing of what he was thinking or feeling. He stood at attention with perfect military bearing, his uniform immaculate, his demeanor radiating competence and authority. When the Hauptmann finished speaking, Jenkins responded in flawless German learned, during a pre-war posting to the embassy in Berlin from 1936 to 1938, where he had served as part of the military attaché's security detail. His German was so perfect, so utterly without accent or grammatical error, that several of the German officers visibly started in surprise. He explained calmly and precisely that all prisoners would receive treatment according to the Geneva Conventions. That rank entitled certain privileges which would be respected, but that all prisoners would show proper respect to their guards, regardless of personal feelings about race or nationality. His tone was not aggressive or defensive, but simply matter of fact, the tone of someone explaining established policy to individuals who had not yet been properly informed. He continued, still in perfect German, explaining the camp regulations in detail. Officers would be housed separately from enlisted men, as required by the Geneva Conventions. Officers would not be required to perform manual labor, though they would be expected to maintain their own quarters. Officers would receive the same rations as enlisted men, because the Geneva Conventions required only that prisoners receive adequate nutrition, not that they receive preferential treatment beyond what their rank demanded under international law. All prisoners, regardless of rank, would treat guards with the same respect they would show to guards of any nationality. Failure to do so would result in disciplinary measures that included loss of privileges and, in extreme cases, solitary confinement. What made Jenkins' response so devastating to the Hauptmann's worldview was not just the content, but the delivery. Here was a man the Hauptmann had been taught to view as inferior, demonstrating linguistic ability that exceeded that of many native German speakers, explaining international law with a precision that suggested formal legal training, and commanding with an authority that transcended nationality or race. Jenkins's German was so perfect that it revealed education and intelligence impossible to dismiss. His bearing was so military that it commanded respect independent of the color of his skin. His authority was so evident that challenging it would have required the Hauptmann to acknowledge his own prejudices explicitly, something he was not prepared to do. The Hauptmann fell silent, his assumptions colliding with reality in a way that was psychologically uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. He had expected crude soldiers with minimal education and poor discipline. He had encountered instead a professional military system operating with efficiency that matched or exceeded anything he had experienced in his own service. He had expected to find confirmation of his superiority and had instead been forced to confront evidence of his error. The cognitive dissonance was profound, and it showed in his face as he struggled to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he had believed. What the German officer did not know, and what made the encounter even more remarkable, was that Jenkins had been denied officer candidacy 6 times, despite qualifications that exceeded those of most white officers who received commissions. He had scores on aptitude tests that placed him in the top percentile nationally. He had recommendations from superior officers who praised his leadership, his intelligence, and his dedication to duty. He had experience that included not just combat and training, but also diplomatic work requiring cultural sensitivity and linguistic skill. Yet 6 times, his applications for officer training had been rejected without explanation. The reasons were never stated officially, but everyone understood that the military was not prepared to commission African American officers in significant numbers, particularly not officers who might end up commanding white soldiers. Jenkins had remained in service because he believed in something larger than his own advancement. He understood that every instance where he demonstrated exceptional competence was a small victory against the system that sought to limit him. He understood that by serving with distinction despite discrimination, he was creating a record that would make it harder for future military leaders to justify continued segregation. He understood that the most powerful argument against prejudice was not rhetoric, but performance so undeniable that it could not be dismissed or minimized. Now, in this moment, his dedication to professionalism became a weapon more powerful than any propaganda, more convincing than any argument, more effective than any military victory in challenging the assumptions of those who encountered him. The incident spread through the prisoner barracks within hours, transmitted through the informal communication networks that prisoners develop in any detention facility. Soldiers whispered about the American sergeant who spoke better German than some of them, who commanded with an authority that transcended nationality or race, who had reduced a regimental commander to silence through the simple expedient of demonstrating competence impossible to deny. The story grew slightly in the telling, as stories do, but the essential facts remained accurate and devastating to the propaganda that had shaped these soldiers' worldview. For men like Richter, who had grown up with propaganda depicting an inferior enemy, each such encounter was a psychological blow that forced a reassessment of everything they had believed. The propaganda had not just been wrong, it had been the opposite of truth. The soldiers they had been taught to view as inferior were demonstrating superiority in every meaningful dimension, better equipped, better supplied, better trained, better led, and more importantly, better in their treatment of those they had defeated. This last point was particularly important because it revealed moral superiority that went beyond mere military effectiveness. It was one thing to defeat an enemy through superior numbers and equipment. It was another thing entirely to defeat an enemy and then treat them with humanity and dignity, despite having every reason and opportunity to seek revenge for atrocities committed. By early April, as the 761st continued its advance deeper into Germany, the stories told by prisoners began to accumulate and spread beyond the immediate camp where Richter and others were held. German soldiers who surrendered to African-American units found themselves treated with a correctness that contrasted sharply with their own military's treatment of prisoners, particularly on the Eastern Front, where Geneva Convention protections were routinely ignored. This was not lost on thoughtful prisoners like Baumann, who recognized that the humanity shown by their captors was not weakness, but rather the behavior of soldiers representing a system confident in its moral authority. A system that needed to brutalize prisoners was a system revealing its own weakness and moral bankruptcy. A system that could afford to treat prisoners humanely was a system that had already won not just militarily, but morally. By early April, as the 761st continued its advance deeper into Germany, the stories told by prisoners began to accumulate and spread. German soldiers who surrendered to African-American units found themselves treated with a correctness that contrasted sharply with their own military's treatment of prisoners, particularly on the Eastern Front. This was not lost on thoughtful prisoners like Baumann, who recognized that the humanity shown by their captors was not weakness, but rather the behavior of soldiers representing a system confident in its moral authority. The 761st Tank Battalion continued operations through April and into May. They participated in the liberation of concentration camps, where the evidence of atrocities committed by the regime they were fighting left no doubt about the moral necessity of their mission. Lieutenant Howard and his crew were among the first American forces to reach a subcamp near Gunskirchen, Austria, in early May. What they witnessed there was beyond description, a horror that reinforced their understanding that this war had been necessary and just. For the German prisoners who had encountered these same soldiers weeks earlier, news of the camp liberations created another profound shock. The men they had been taught to view as inferior were the ones who documented crimes, who provided aid to survivors, who ensured that the world would know what had happened. The moral high ground was not ambiguous, it was absolute. Klaus Richter spent the remainder of 1945 in a prisoner camp in France before being repatriated to Germany in early 1946. He returned to a country destroyed physically and morally, where the full scope of the regime's crimes was becoming undeniable. He carried with him memories that contradicted everything he had once believed. In the decades that followed, he would tell his story to his children and eventually to historians, interested in documenting how German soldiers' attitudes change through direct contact with the forces they fought. In a recorded interview in 1987, when Richter was 64 years old, he spoke with remarkable honesty about his transformation. He described his shame at the words he had shouted during his surrender, his confusion at the professional treatment he received, and his growing realization that the propaganda he had consumed was not just false, but deliberately designed to dehumanize and enable atrocity. He credited African American soldiers with treating him better than his own military had treated captured enemies, and he acknowledged that this experience forced him to confront the moral bankruptcy of the regime he had served. Werner Baumann also survived the war and returned to Germany in 1946. A teacher, before being conscripted in 1939, he spent his post-war years working in education, focusing on teaching critical thinking skills to young people. In his lectures, he often referenced his experience as a prisoner, emphasizing how propaganda could shape perception and how direct experience could shatter false beliefs. He maintained correspondence with several historians studying the African American military experience, providing detailed accounts of his observations. For the soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion, the war ended in May 1945, but their struggle for recognition and equality did not. Despite their exemplary service, they returned to a United States that remained segregated. Lieutenant James Howard, who had led his platoon through some of the fiercest combat of the final months, came home to a country where he could not eat in certain restaurants or stay in certain hotels. The contradiction was painful and obvious. Sergeant Robert Hayes returned to Detroit and the automotive industry, where his skills as a mechanic and his leadership experience should have guaranteed advancement. Instead, he found himself blocked by the same racial barriers that had prevented his officer candidacy during the war. He joined the early civil rights movement, and his experience proving himself under fire gave him a moral authority that could not be easily dismissed. Staff Sergeant William Thompson, who had responded to hatred with professional discipline, became an educator in Birmingham. He taught history, emphasizing the importance of primary sources and critical analysis over propaganda. His students learned about the war from someone who had lived it, and they learned that dignity and professionalism were more powerful responses to hatred than anger. The broader historical impact of units like the 761st was profound. The performance of African American soldiers during the Second World War provided undeniable evidence that segregation could not be justified on grounds of capability or character. President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 in July 1948, beginning the process of desegregating the United States military. The stories of units like the 761st, the Tuskegee Airmen, and the 992nd Infantry Regiment made it impossible to maintain the fiction that African American soldiers were less capable. The German prisoners who had encountered these units and experienced their professionalism carried those stories back to Germany, where they contributed to a post-war reckoning with propaganda and prejudice. Historians conducting research in the 1970s and 80s found that German veterans who had been captured by African American units often expressed a particular awareness of how propaganda had deceived them. Their testimonies provided valuable insights into how direct human contact could overcome even deeply ingrained prejudice. The 761st Tank Battalion was credited with numerous achievements during its service. They supported the crossing of the Rhine, participated in the final offensives into southern Germany, and contributed to the liberation of concentration camps. Individual soldiers received decorations including Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Purple Hearts. Yet their story remained largely unknown for decades after the war because the United States military did not widely publicize the achievements of segregated units. This began to change in the 1990s as historians gave increased attention to the African American military experience. Veterans like James Howard, who lived until 2004, participated in oral history projects that documented their service. The contrast between their treatment during the war by German prisoners and their treatment after the war by their own country highlighted the persistent injustice of segregation and discrimination. One particularly powerful moment occurred in 1997 when Klaus Richter, then 74 years old, traveled to the United States to participate in a symposium on the Second World War. He specifically requested to meet veterans of the 761st Tank Battalion. The meeting was arranged in Washington, D.C., and Richter found himself face-to-face with Sergeant Robert Hayes, then 83 years old. The two men spoke for over an hour through a translator, though Richter had learned some English over the decades. Richter apologized for the words he had shouted during his surrender, explaining that they came from a place of propaganda, induced hatred and fear. Hayes accepted the apology with the same grace he had shown 52 years earlier when he had treated German prisoners with professional correctness despite the insults. Richter described how the experience of being captured by African-American troops had forced him to question everything he had been taught. He explained that the professionalism and humanity shown by his captors had been a crucial step in his rejection of the ideology he had served. Hayes listened and then shared his own story of returning home to face continued discrimination despite his military service. The irony was not lost on either man. German prisoners had been treated better by African-American soldiers than those same soldiers were treated by much of their own country. The conversation was recorded and later published in a journal of military history. It became a powerful example of how warfare could transform not just through military victory, but through the moral example of how victors treated the defeated. The professionalism of the 761st and other African-American units had advanced two causes simultaneously: the military victory over a regime that had elevated racism to genocidal policy, and the moral case against racism in the United States military and society. The documentation of these experiences contributed to a broader understanding of the Second World War as not just a military conflict, but a moral one, where the values demonstrated by soldiers in combat and in victory mattered as much as tactical achievements. The African-American soldiers who served in segregated units faced dual challenges: proving themselves as soldiers while representing a community fighting for civil rights at home. Their performance under these circumstances was exceptional by any measure. The statistical record supports this assessment. The 761st Tank Battalion participated in combat operations for over 6 months without a single instance of failure to follow orders or battlefield retreat. Their maintenance records showed higher operational readiness rates than the average for armored units. Their casualty rates were consistent with other units facing similar combat conditions, demonstrating that they took the same risks and endured the same hardships as any soldiers. Yet these statistics only tell part of the story. The real measure of their impact was in the lives they touched and the assumptions they challenged. Every German soldier who was captured by African-American troops and treated with professional correctness became a witness to the gap between propaganda and reality. Every interaction that contradicted racist stereotypes was a small victory in a larger struggle for human dignity. The transformation of soldiers like Klaus Richter, from believers in propaganda to witnesses against it, demonstrates the power of direct human experience to overcome even systematic indoctrination. Richter had been raised in a society that promoted racial hierarchy, served in a military that institutionalized these beliefs, and fought for a regime that pursued genocidal policies based on racist ideology. Yet his direct experience of being treated humanely by the very soldiers he had been taught to dehumanize forced a fundamental reassessment of his beliefs. This pattern repeated across thousands of similar encounters. German soldiers captured by the 992nd Infantry Regiment in Italy, by supply units in France, by engineering battalions in Belgium, all carried similar stories back to prison camps and eventually back to Germany. The cumulative effect was a body of testimony that documented not just military history, but a profound lesson about human dignity, professional ethics, and the power of moral example. For the African-American soldiers who served in the Second World War, the recognition they deserved came slowly and often posthumously. Many of the soldiers of the 761st returned to civilian life without their service being widely acknowledged. They faced continued discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations. The GI Bill, which provided educational and housing benefits to veterans, was administered in ways that often excluded African-American veterans through local discrimination. Yet their service had planted seeds that would grow into the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Veterans of segregated units became leaders in demanding equal treatment, and their military service provided a moral authority that was difficult to challenge. How could a nation deny equal rights to men who had fought and bled for that nation? The question became increasingly difficult to answer, and the eventual dismantling of legal segregation owed much to the service and sacrifice of soldiers like those in the 761st. The legacy of these soldiers extends beyond their military achievements. They demonstrated that excellence could not be suppressed by prejudice, that professionalism could triumph over hatred, and that the moral high ground belonged to those who treated others with dignity, regardless of circumstances. These lessons remain relevant decades after the war's end. In 2009, the 761st Tank Battalion was collectively honored by the Department of Defense for their service during the Second World War. Surviving veterans, most in their 80s and 90s, attended a ceremony in Washington, D.C., where their contributions were officially recognized. Among those present was the son of Klaus Richter, who had traveled from Germany to witness the ceremony and share his father's testimony about how these soldiers had changed his father's life. The ceremony included the presentation of a unit citation and individual medals that had been delayed or denied due to discrimination. For the aging veterans present, the recognition was bittersweet. It acknowledged their service, but also implicitly acknowledged that this recognition should have come decades earlier. Yet they accepted it with the same grace and dignity they had shown throughout their service. One veteran, Thomas Richardson, who had driven Lieutenant Howard's Sherman tank through the Rhine crossing and multiple subsequent operations, was asked by a reporter what he wanted people to know about his service. His answer was simple but profound. He said that he and his fellow soldiers had done their duty not for recognition, but because it was right, because the cause was just, and because they believed that by proving themselves in combat, they could change minds and advance the cause of equality. He noted that changing the mind of even one enemy soldier through professional conduct was a victory as meaningful as any tactical achievement. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion and the German soldiers whose lives they touched illustrates fundamental truths about warfare, humanity, and social change. It demonstrates that military professionalism transcends personal prejudice, that moral example can be as powerful as military force, and that human beings are capable of profound transformation when confronted with evidence that contradicts their assumptions. The soldiers of the 761st entered combat, knowing they would face skepticism and discrimination from both enemies and allies. They responded not with bitterness, but with excellence, not with anger, but with professionalism. In doing so, they won battles, changed minds, and advanced the cause of human dignity. Their victory was complete, not just when German forces surrendered, but when German soldiers recognized that the men they had been taught to despise were worthy of respect and even admiration. This recognition did not come easily or universally. Many German soldiers never questioned the propaganda they had consumed. Many returned to post-war Germany, clinging to racist beliefs despite all evidence to the contrary. But for soldiers like Klaus Richter and Werner Baumann, the encounter with African-American troops was transformative. It forced them to confront the lies they had been told and the evil they had served. It provided a pathway toward moral reconstruction in a society that desperately needed to understand how it had been led so disastrously astray. The humanity shown by African-American soldiers toward German prisoners was not naive or foolish. It was strategic, moral, and ultimately more powerful than hatred. It demonstrated that the Allied cause was not just militarily superior, but morally superior. It proved that the values of democracy, human rights, and equal dignity were not just abstractions, but principles that could be lived even in the chaos and violence of warfare. Today, the story of the 761st Tank Battalion is taught in military academies as an example of professional excellence under extraordinary circumstances. It is studied by historians examining the African-American experience during the Second World War. It is cited by scholars analyzing how prejudice can be overcome through direct human contact and moral example. The tank that Lieutenant James Howard commanded, the Deliverance, is preserved in a museum, a physical reminder of a unit that delivered not just military victory, but a powerful message about human potential and dignity. The transformation of German soldiers from believers in racist propaganda to witnesses against it represents one of the many small but significant victories achieved during the Second World War. Each changed mind was a step toward a better post-war world. Each moment of recognition that all soldiers shared common humanity, regardless of race, was a victory for the values that the Allies claimed to represent. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.